I'm Shannon Tiesi with the Diplomat, and I'm here today at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., where I'm very happy to be sitting down with Richard Weitz, who is a senior fellow here at Hudson, and he's going to be talking with us today about the two summits recently held in Ufa, Russia. Richard, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Ever since the Ukraine crisis began, we've been hearing this litany from the West, and particularly the United States, about how isolated Russia has become. And yet, in the past week, we saw Russia host two international summits, the BRICS Summit and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, that would seem to counter that narrative of isolation. So how would you reconcile those two?
Well, Russia is alienated from its natural partners. It should be, if you look at the level of income, the geopolitical interests of Russia, where Russia should be in the future, it should be tied with the West. It should be a partner of the United States and Europe, economically, strategically, all over. But for whatever reason, and I can give you several, Russia has been moving away from the West and moving closer towards other countries, Asia in particular. And that's current orientation. I'm not sure if that's its long-run orientation.
So is this sort of a pivot to Asia, to borrow a phrase, is this being driven mostly by the rift between Russia and the West that came from the Ukraine situation, or is this something that's part of a longer-term geopolitical strategy where Russia feels, regardless of the Ukraine situation, it's better casting its lot in with China and Asia?
Right. Historians of Russia always see the trend that there are a group of Russians who, like me, think Russia should be part of the West. There are then Russians who actually feel closer to Asia, and you've got this reoccurring push in the Soviet times and then since in post-Soviet times to move Russia closer to Asia. I mean, the same arguments you hear the Obama administration and others about the Asia, why there should be an Asia pivot, economic center of the world, geopolitical orientations, more flexible, and so on. And then there's a large group, which I would put the current leadership of Russians, who think Russia is unique. It's a unique generation, civilization. It can align with other powers on particular issues, but really it needs to say itself independent. And I think that's where Russia is at the moment, even though they'd like to move closer to Asia. I think there's just barriers that are impeding that.
So could you go into that a little bit more? What sort of barriers are there for Russia moving closer to Asia, and are there any long-term plans for how to overcome those?
Right. Recently, the famous Soviet foreign minister and one-time prime minister of Russia, Yevgeny Primakov, died. And he was trying, even under Soviet times, to establish an alliance between Russia, China, and India. He saw them as, the great Asian powers in terms of population, in terms of economic resources. And right there, you see a problem which has always bedeviled Russia, that the partners it wants to have are often in conflict, be it China and India, or Vietnam and China, and there are others. Now, this is not to say that we don't have our own problems with, South Korea and Japan, but Russia has always found it difficult to break out of a bilateral relationship with a close partner, previously India, now China, develop a more, what they would like to see, a broader multilateral bloc. And you could see these tensions at work at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization right now in particular.
Mm-hmm. So let's move to talking about the SCO a little bit. A very interesting move to bring both India and Pakistan into the fold, which should become official next year. How is that going to change the dynamics of the group, and also how seriously it's taken by other world powers?
Right. This is something, it is an interesting development. For a decade, the SCO had this expansion deadlock. Its original members are still those countries that joined in 2001. Those the full 6 members, Russia, China, and all the Central Asian countries like Turkmenistan. At various points, Iran, India, and Pakistan have all expressed interest. Iran and Pakistan more ardently than India. Though India has now come around. But there was always a problem about getting them to agree which one would come in or which two, and the China-India tensions were impeding that. Russia had its concerns about Pakistan. Bringing in Iran brings in a whole bunch of other geopolitical and other baggage that they just didn't want to deal with and still don't want to deal with. But they were able to break it. under Russian leadership, I think that was a strong goal of Russia, was to push through at least in principle, the expansion. And that, I think, will occur soon with India and Pakistan joining. The implications are interesting. It could strengthen the SCO because now you've got two middle-sized powers, large population, have nuclear weapons, have a great impact on various aspects of Asian affairs. But it could also weaken further the coherence of the organization. I mean, India would presumably resist turning this into some kind of authoritarian bloc, and Pakistan has its own ties, however strained, with the West, particularly militarily. There also, at the moment, the Russia-China condominium works out pretty well with that leadership. Bringing those other two countries are already seeing resistance by some of the smaller states because that's going to reduce them to third-tier status. For example, Uzbekistan is now going to chair the organization, taking the chair from Russia. And already the president of Uzbekistan, Islam Karimov, has said, well, we got to study this very closely, not rush it, because he understands that if India and Pakistan are in, Uzbekistan will follow that third-tier level of influence.
Mm. So to date, the SCO, as you mentioned, has been largely sort of a two-way leadership with Russia and China, and they've used it as a kind of a proving ground for their two pet projects for the Central Asia region. You have the Eurasian Economic Union on Russia's side, you have the Silk Road Economic Belt on China's side, and they've now tied these two together. Is that going to continue to be the case with the SCO? Because India, for example, has issues with China's Silk Road plan, and there's not really a natural fit with the EEU. So are those two goals going to continue to be a thread through the SCO, or are they going to get lost in the shuffle?
What's interesting is this has not been occurring through the SCO. Basically, the major foreign political, diplomatic, economic policies of Russia and China, even their cooperation, it's been outside the SCO, outside the SCO's existence. So China is pursuing the Silk Road, only loosely connected to the SCO. I mean, sometimes whenever they give loans or take acts, they'll say we're doing this in part of the SCO, but it's really just bilateral arrangement between that China and the particular country building the pipeline in or developing the trade agreement. Russia has been pursuing this possibly alternative structure, Eurasian Economic Union, building on the further customs union, but that's been totally independent of the SCO. They were supposed to, at this conference, bring the two together within the SCO framework, but that did not occur. And so this is just a further sign of how weak the SCO has been economically. I mean, the resource it has available independent of the member governments is almost nil. It's always been they're dependent on the member governments to give something and call it with an SCO agreement. But often that's tied in, for example, China is the leading driver here. It will loan money to a country, but in return it expects access to the resources, control over the infrastructure built towards China, not elsewhere. So I would argue that this is going to be a problem as we go further, that the SCOs is not having any really independent impact on the economic policies of the two most important members, Russia and China. If the SCO were to disappear tomorrow, I don't think the policies would change.
Mm-hmm. The SCO has generally had more of a sort of political security focus, fighting the so-called three evils: terrorism, separatism, religious extremism. And we saw Russian President Vladimir Putin reference that in his remarks at the SCO summit. He talked about the need to ensure stability in Afghanistan. He talked about the need to keep Islamic State from making inroads in the region. Is there any sign that the group is actually going to play an active role towards achieving those goals, or are we going to see more of the same, which is joint training and pronouncements and not much tangible impact?
Right. As you know, the Diplomat itself is having a lively debate of articles about how serious this threat is. Is this a hype terrorist threat, or is it a genuine threat? And if so, how genuine? The governments themselves will generally express concern about a terrorist threat, but in practice, you can see nuances. I mean, the Kazakhs seem a bit more comfortable than, for example, the Uzbeks about what might be happening in Afghanistan. The organization itself, it does have these counterterrorism exercises. But that's it. It's never actually conducted a counterterrorist operation. It's just once a year or every other year, they will have rather powerful paramilitary forces, often regular military forces, engage in exercises and claim these are designed to suppress terrorists. You can see a bit of a nuance, how they think of the terrorist threat. I mean, for example, the Chinese, their nightmare is another Tiananmen, right? You know, you have a mass protest movement, and you've got to go in and suppress that. Whereas the Russians are thinking more another Chechnya, this protracted insurgency, which they need to, just defeat through more military methods. They have this regional anti-terrorist structure, which I actually visited. It's in Tashkent. And it's interesting, they were complaining that they have the same problems that the DHS here has, that of getting the governments to ratify the agreements to sign, to reconcile the name. I mean, everybody has a different name for a terrorist group. Some people, what they consider terrorists, are not considered terrorists in another country, and they have to sort out all the different legal systems. It's kind of amusing, this vision we have of these states united against terrorism under this authoritarian banner, when actually they're struggling with some of the same complexities our agency have. So at the moment, their military and counterterrorist potential is that. It's a potential. We haven't really seen it very active. We have no evidence that it's been affecting terrorism in any particular way, or that it has been. It's something we just can't see any clear outcome.
So to wrap up, I just want to talk about something that's a major factor with the SCO, but goes beyond that, and that is the Russia-China relationship. They've been drawing closer in recent years, but you also have this line of argument that they're never going to be actual allies, that their interests are divergent, that they're actually in competition more than they're cooperating. So what are your thoughts on the future of the Russia-China relationship?
I have to acknowledge that I and others have made a lot of mistakes in this area in our forecast, so take that with a grain of salt. For example, we thought originally when the Soviet Union broke up that Central Asia would become an object of rivalry between Russia and China. They would compete for influence under these countries now that they weren't under Soviet control. Actually, it's been a unifying force. The two countries have combined together to limit Western influence, keep the regimes in power, suppress terrorists as they see it, exploit its resources. And the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has helped to reinforce that. It's sort of a reassurance mechanism. The Chinese, whenever they do something in Central Asia, they say they're always doing this as part of their contribution to the SCO. They're very deferential. They don't challenge Russia's security domination. I mean, that's a whole separate Russian military alliance structure, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is independent of the SCO, and the Chinese haven't threatened that. And the Russians have been more accommodating than one would think towards allowing China to gain dominant economic influence in the region. It's possible that they've given a choice between having the Europeans and the Chinese there. They'd rather have the Chinese, accepting they can't really do anything about it. And also the Chinese and local governments have been skillful about, for example, when they have a major oil or energy development project, they always make sure a Russian company has like 10% of it or something, so they get some economic payoffs. But in the future, this could continue, this nice equipoise between them. They have China strong economically, but allowing Russia to take the charge of the security primacy. But you could envision ways they would split, in particular as China's economic stakes in Central Asia continue to grow, as this domestic terrorism threat to China continues to fester. It is possible that the Chinese will conclude at some point they can't really trust Russia to be strong enough to secure their interests, and that they would need to take a more active role, perhaps establishing military bases there, or at least selling the countries their weapons. So far that hasn't occurred, and at least I've been surprised by what I thought was always the barrier to Russia-China cooperation is continually being surpassed, and so this relation at the moment is just getting better and better. But you can imagine this could change over time, particularly what happens with the relationship between the United States. And I think that the U.S. can have some influence on how this progresses.
Thank you so much, Richard, for talking us through these interesting issues.
Thanks again. I'm an avid fan of the Diplomat. It's nice to be able to participate in this opportunity.
Well, thank you. And thank you for tuning in. Once again, I'm Shannon Tiesi with the Diplomat.